everybody for joining us. We're trying to be respectful of your time, so we're going to get started. We've got a lot of folks online, but we are recording this for people who can't attend, and we'll make it available for them later. So what I'm going to be going over in the next half an hour is our affirmative action plan requirements and also our AAP results for the 20 and 21 plan year. If you have questions, I would recommend just putting them into the chat, and we'll address them as we go through towards the end of the presentation. Okay, so first things first, what is an affirmative action plan? I think a lot of people have heard the terms affirmative action, and a lot of times they hear that, maybe with a lowercase a, affirmative action. When I think about it, I always think about it as capital A affirmative action, because it comes directly from an executive order that we'll talk about in a moment. And so when I think about affirmative action, I think about it in the legal construct of what we are required to do as a government contractor. So what this basically says, and we'll get in the history in a moment, is that federal contractors and subcontractors must take affirmative action for covered employers in order to advance and protect qualified minorities, women, persons with disabilities, and covered veterans. And that can include training programs and outreach efforts and other actions that you take, and that those actions are codified into your SOPs and written into your personnel policies. So it's pretty fundamental. These laws go back they go back far beyond what I've got on the screen here. Johnson signed Executive Order 11246, but the tenets and the basics of affirmative action programs predate him and go all the way back to Roosevelt, who signed some certain affirmative action and non-discrimination laws as far back as World War II. And those applied only to the defense contractor industry. And then as these things evolved, the EEOs applied it to then all government contractors, not just government employees, and then out to subcontractors. And then, as we'll see, some further laws subsequent have taken it even further. So what EEO 11246 says is that for federal contractors that are doing more than $10,000, it's not $10,000, it's $50,000, but it's irrelevant. It's a very small de minimis number. That they do not discriminate against employees on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, et cetera, et cetera. We've had additional titles added to that over the years. Sexual orientation, gender identity, and national origin weren't part of the original executive order, but have been added to the legal framework by subsequent administrations. And I think that that's an ever-evolving list of categories that will probably, continue to grow, as our community grows and evolves over time. In addition to the basic fundamental non-discrimination tenets, it also requires employers to, not take adverse action against protected employees, but in fact to take some positive steps either to protect or advance those employees. And we'll talk about kind of the what it means and what it doesn't mean in a couple of slides. Hand in glove with the executive order requirements, we have two other laws that we also pay attention to. OFCCP, who's the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, they're the ones that monitor compliance with all three of these. So when they come in, they'll look at all three. So we actually have three different plans. By and large, they are copy-paste of each other with small changes to, basically change the language of who it is that we're looking to protect. So rather than having one single plan, because we have three laws, we're required to have three separate plans, but again, they're pretty repetitive. The second plan is for Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act, and really in fundamental tenet, it's the same as the executive order. It's that you can't discriminate against people based on a protected category, and in this case, that category is individuals with disabilities. So before I move on to individuals with disabilities, just so we kind of explain what that means, it's been further codified since the 1973 503 Act. A lot of you are familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act that further defined it and further provided some legal framework and protection for individuals with disabilities. But in fundamental terms, it means a disability, either perceived or otherwise, or actual, perceived or actual, that prohibits an individual from being able to actively participate in what they call a major life activity. So the photograph here obviously is from the 70s. This is people in wheelchairs, but it also affects everything from sight impairment, learning development. It could be mental illness, depression, blindness, physical disabilities, inability to, you name it, right? In any what they call any major life activity, right? So if you have, something wrong with your finger that prevents you from skydiving, that's not going to be a disability. But if you have any activity that prevents you from, say walking upstairs or, being on your feet for a long period of time or things of that nature, really anything can be a disability. And even though, again, the photograph here shows folks who are kind of obviously disabled, the majority of folks who classify as disabled are not visually obvious. They may have conditions such as diabetes or epilepsy that you're not going to be able to see. Okay, and that's why we ask people to self-certify, and we'll get into that in just a moment. The last category is our veterans, and this comes from VEVRA, the Vietnam Era Veterans Readjustment Act. Again, over the arc of time, this law has also been modified. Can I ask everybody to mute out, if you will? That would be helpful. The Vietnam Era Veterans Act has been modified over the arc of time to protect not just Vietnam era veterans, but for all intents and purposes, all veterans. It's not technically all veterans, but it covers such a large swath of the current veteran population that it's almost all veterans. So it's Vietnam era veterans to present, and then I think there's a gap in years, and then there's new laws that pick up from the first Gulf War in 1991, and anybody who's been in service since then. So the short answer is it protects probably most people who are ever in the service, with maybe some small exceptions. Okay, so who are these laws required of, and what do they require us to do? Again, it's for contractors with more than 50 employees and more than 50,000 in government contracts. You have to have a corporate ride plan, which we do, and then you also have to have site-specific plans for any locations that have more than 50 employees. So for the 2020-2021 plan years, we've got site-specific plans only for Burlingame and Jacksonville. And then next year, that might be different. Next year, we might be required to have a site-specific plan for Lakewood, for example. And we've had one for Lakewood in the past, right? But right now, that number is dipped just below 50. We're kind of near the cusp. So we might be required to have a plan there next year. Any location that gets more than 50 employees, whether it's a project site or a permanent office, we would do a site-specific plan. In that plan, what do we do? Status, all job applicants. So we're not just tracking our workforce, but we're also tracking everyone who's interested in joining our workforce. We then compare that data, the local population that's available for that office or that project, as the case may be. What we do is we then identify areas of underutilization, and I'll talk about what that means in a subsequent slide. Once you identify that underutilization, then you take what we call affirmative action to increase your applicant pool and also therefore increase your new minority and female, disabled, and veteran employees. And that can include outreach efforts, setting internal goals, having additional levels of review in terms of layoff or terminations, anything that's, again, an action that you can take to try and make your numbers a little bit better. And then obviously, above all, eliminating discrimination amongst current employees. I will say that the fundamental tenet, again, of the law is you shall not discriminate. OFCCP has indicated that in most cases, they find active discrimination across all of their audits in fewer than 2% of workforces. So actual evidence of discrimination that the OFCCP can verify is not a very large number, right? And really what we're looking at is kind of overt black and white cases where it's pretty obvious. The bigger issue is the systemic, unprovable types of discrimination that really only manifest itself when you look at the data. Okay, so that's what the AAP helps us do. It helps us look at our data. Okay, So that's what's required in an AAP. Let's talk about what's not required, because I do want to dispel any misunderstandings, or a lot of people have preconceptions about what affirmative action means. It doesn't mean that you have quotas. We have no quotas. There's nothing about quotas in any of the plans. There's no requirements that certain employees have to be hired or promoted. Hey, we're underutilized with this group. The next promotion has got to be X. The plan doesn't work that way. You're always going to be asked and required to hire the best candidate. The way that affirmative action works is we try and increase that candidate pool, so the statistical chances of you picking a diverse candidate are thereby increased. One of the truisms of affirmative action is that workforces do tend to replicate themselves. So if you have a large number of male employees, you're more likely to get male referrals. If you have a large number of white employees, you're more likely to get white referrals. So again, affirmative action is just trying to increase the diversity of the pool, and then over time, the diversity of promotions, the diversity of everything else will slowly but surely work its way through the organization. What else does AAP not require you to do? It doesn't require you to create any open positions. Hey, we don't have enough of this type of race or this type of gender. Let's create some new jobs that we don't really need, and we'll find something for these people to do. That's not a thing. And it doesn't require us to factor in race in any way, shape, or form, or gender when hiring or firing. Okay, so again, these things should always be done on their merits of performance. What AAP is about increasing the pool. Also, just this last bullet point here, we don't track any of our overseas projects or employees. The AAP is confined to just the US. Okay, so the obligations are that we maintain all that data for, again, employees and applicants, and then also that data is kind of recertified every 5 years. Certain things, veteran status is one, your disability, even your racial perception. You may have checked the box one way when you applied, and you may choose to check that box a different way 5 years from now. You may not have had a disability when you started. You may have one now. You may have had one when you started, and you may not have it now. So for that reason, we ask people, I should say ask people, we give people the opportunity to recertify every 5 years, and if new data comes in, we update our data. Okay, how is that data analyzed? It's tracked by job category, and there's, I think, 7 different categories. We don't necessarily have employees in all of them. For example, one of the categories is sales. We don't have that, but we look at officers and managers, professional employees, office and clerical, craft, labor, and trade, and then service workers. I also don't think we have any service workers in our last audit, but they might get lumped in with the craft and labor. At any rate, we try and we're not a huge organization. We're not, a Boeing or a Walmart with thousands and thousands of employees. So we try and make our groups meaningful. Sometimes that means we kind of kludge them together. Otherwise, we have a lot of small disparate groups, and there's not enough groups to really pull any statistical meaningful data out of. That data gets looked at once a year as of December 31st. This year, because we were going to have an audit, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, we also did a mid-year update. So our plan is actually current as of June 30th of this year, and that's the data that I'm going to talk about. And then we analyzed that to, again, the nationwide county and MSA statistical data. And then we have to fill out a form called the EEO-1, and that gets filled out and sent to the government annually. And that date's been bouncing all around due to a variety of political issues. It's normally September 30th. I think now for the last 3 years, it's been off schedule to March. One year they even skipped reporting altogether. With the new presidential administration, we'll see what happens, but it might hopefully get set back to an annual predictable date. And then once a year, our data goes in. Right now, we're still looking at 2010 census data, and that's what we're comparing to. Next year, obviously, we'll have some new data once the 2020 census data is announced. We do look at data on 3 different levels, national, state, and county. We look at it for a couple of different reasons. One is even within an area like Burlingame, normally we would say, hey, we're looking at the Burlingame statistical data within the 5-county area to see who our applicant pool is. But for some jobs, sometimes we might say, well, even though the job is going to be situated in Burlingame, we would be willing to relocate. So we're going to look at national data because we're really looking at national applicants. Or in some cases, we may say, look, we're just going to look nationwide And whoever we find, you know, they get to pick the closest office they want to move to, and they can work in there. And I don't care if it's Hudson or San Antonio or Burlingame, but when we find that candidate, that's where they'll be. So sometimes we're looking at national data, sometimes we're looking at county by county data. Okay, so as I go forward into our results, I thought these two graphs were helpful. I will apologize simply because these two graphs came from two different sources, so the colors are not consistent at all, and I understand that. You have to ignore the colors and just focus on the data. But what this shows is the 2010 decennial census data versus what the 2045 projection is going to look at. And the takeaway that you can see there is that almost all the minority groups are increasing, some by a little bit, some by a lot, and the white group is going to is projected to decrease by a pretty substantial amount. And so as we go forward year after year, because it'll be long after I'm retired, we expect to see probably some different trends just in terms of what the workforce looks like. Okay, so what is underutilization? Underutilization, again, is once we've looked at our data and we've looked at the data for the county at large, where we've got a statistically significant shortfall. So in our data, a lot of times it's a little bit tough, right? Because we may say, I'll just, for example, I'll say the estimating department, right? So the estimating department, if there's only 7 to 10 people in the entire department, it's going to be very tough to have statistically the right number of one of each, because 10 is not a statistically significant number, right? So we might be, let's say this is just purely hypothetical, but let's just say within the estimating department, we have that would indicate that we would have 10% Hispanics, 11% Hispanics, and we only have 1 out of the 10. So we're only going to be 10%. Well, we really only have 2 possibilities, right? We could be 10% or we could be 20% if we had 1 Hispanic or 2 Hispanics. So the fact that we're 10 rather than 11 would not be considered underutilization, again, because it's not considered to be statistically significant. So as you look across of our data, we have areas where we're under, but it's not underutilization. And we'll talk about kind of what that looks like in terms of where we are underutilized. When we have underutilization, this is where the affirmative and affirmative action takes place. We have a lot of things that we have to do to take actions to decrease that underutilization. We send job openings out to everywhere. And when I say everywhere, I mean everywhere. Our job openings go to about 100 or more different professional organizations, trying to get as many candidates as we can, right? We don't just post jobs up to Monster or LinkedIn and hope we get some good, diverse candidates. Our job openings go out to the Americans Job Bank, and through a variety of state and regional networks, they go out to a huge number of minority, female, veteran, and disability focused networks to try and increase the number of applicants that we get. In fact, one of the requirements of AAP is that you also try and track the applicants that you're getting back in and find out where they came from, because they want you to identify, hey, just because you sent 50 job openings to this one minority focused agency, how many resumes did you get back? Because if you're not getting back any resumes, then it tells you need to change your plan, because that organization is not good. Maybe that organization is just focused on white collar sales types of employees, right? And they're never going to send anybody to a construction company, because that's not the type of applicants that they have. So they ask us to monitor that data, and to make sure that what we're doing is not only affirmative action, but it's action that has results and it's action that makes sense. The other thing that we're encouraged to do is actively identify and encourage employees for promotion. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. I would say that we also really, not only do we just send out things and say, hey, I hope we get some good resumes come in. In certain cases, we just aggressively go and look. And I'll just use an example. When we were searching for our CFO, and we're very, very happy with the CFO that we ended up with, but we looked very, very hard to find female candidates for that role. And I'll just tell you, it was very difficult, and we did not find a lot of female candidates that were in our area that had the industry experience. But the point is that it was a step that was taken, and it was a step that was taken with kind of considerable hours of effort to try and to try and generate more interest, because the initial, tranches of resumes that we were getting, we weren't getting a lot of diversity in those resumes. So again, that's just another example of affirmative action. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Other outreach, again, we publish in a lot of magazines. We go to the local job networks. And then when we're sourcing with universities, we're very focused on this to make sure that we're in touch with universities. Have a lot of minority and female sub-organizations. And so, again, to be a pretty good pipeline, albeit only for the entry-level positions, but still that's where all of this starts. Okay. Advertising the open positions, I think I've already talked about. The key thing that is important for us here on this call is to make, when we do this right, when everything goes through Margie for recruiting, as it should, and since I've been back, I can't think of any examples where it hasn't been, but back in the old ECC days, I can definitely remember times when people would get hired by project managers on project sites, and we would kind of find out about it later. That's when AP steps get missed. And again, I don't think we need to harp on it, because I can't think that it's ever happened in the last couple of years to my memory. But just make sure that everything goes through Margie at HR, because that's how we make sure it all gets posted, it all gets tracked, and that all that data is appropriate. Don't ever just, hire your buddy or hire some person who came into your job trailer and send them through the system. All right, self-ID form, I talked about this a little bit. This is the one that many of us are probably familiar with, but for new applicants, it's all online. Everything's on the job site. And again, you just check the right box. That's how we know who you are. It's all private data. Nobody else sees it. And again, we do ask people to verify this data every 5 years if they've had anything that changed. When we talk about tracking applicants, applicants is defined as anybody who responds to an advertisement, whether or not you even think they're qualified or bring them in for a resume. So, if I post a position that says, I want somebody to be a contracts person and they have zero experience being a contracts person, I still track their data. So it's pretty universal. And again, if everybody goes through the ECC.net website, they get reverted to job site. It's seamless. They won't even know it's happening. But they'll go straight through our system. They'll see the online form to check that data, and then that data goes into the database. Okay. The definition was recently clarified in terms of applicants, in terms of discrimination, that an applicant is anybody who meets all the qualifications of the job. And so you need to think through about what your job requirement is. This really isn't about affirmative action. This is more about legal discrimination. But for example, if your job description says you must have significant experience in a technical field, you can't disqualify somebody because they don't have a degree. If your job says you must have a degree, then great. That's a specific qualification that you would be able to exclude them. So we want to be, sometimes Margie will push back on you on your job descriptions when you're putting job notices out. And that's the reason for it, is they do have to follow a legal standard so that we can prevent claims of discrimination down the line. All right, other things that we do, again, you see the EEO notices on all of our website and all of our postings. That just lets applicants know that it's going to be a fair and equal environment when they come in to apply for jobs with us. And then we also post policies that you've probably seen in your offices or your break rooms. These are pretty fundamental things. All right, so how do we check compliance? The OFCCP, like I mentioned, they come in and audit. We haven't been audited in eons. We were scheduled for a veterans audit this year, but I'll talk about that. It was actually canceled due to, frankly, the great work and the good numbers that we had. But that's the closest we've come to having an audit in the last probably 15 or 20 years. All right. If you don't do well in those audits, hopefully this will never happen to us. You can get fined. You can have to enter into compliance agreements or engage in increased monitoring. There's a lot of penalties. So we don't ever want to be on that side. We've never been close. So for OFCCP, I just mentioned we were scheduled for a veterans, and so this was actually canceled on us recently. Many of you may have seen on EchoNet or from our emails, we applied for and won what is called the Department of Labor's Hire Vets Platinum Medallion status. And basically what that does is it looks at a variety of factors: how many veterans you have, percentages, how many veterans you hired, percentages, how many veterans, were let go over the past year. They're not being terminated in disproportionate numbers. They look at whether you have a mentorship program, which we did, that veterans are able to participate in, and a few other boxes to check. And depending on how your numbers strike out, you can either be at a platinum level status, which is the highest, or a gold level status, which is also good. This was our first year applying, and we did achieve platinum level status. As a result, with our consultant that we were working with, he said, you might want to let the auditor know you just got that and see what happens, because they canceled another client's audit. And sure enough, I emailed them, and within 2 days, they canceled our audit and probably saved us, countless hours and tens of thousands of dollars that it would have taken to, just manage that audit. So having good results leads to good results and less audit. So that's another reason why AAP is important. Okay, so let's talk about our results in general, and I'll move into the kind of the second section of the this training. So as you see here, this is our data as of 6/30, 336 total employees. You see the minority and the female numbers there. Good, not great. I think there's room for improvement in both of these numbers. When I look at the new hire numbers over the past year, that's a positive sign. So in both cases, you'll see minorities cooking at about 27%, females about the same. With new hires, we're at 35% for both, right? So tracking, much better for new hires than for the base population. As you see, though, our numbers are small, right? So statistically small, literally 1 or 2 employees can make a big difference. And I want everybody to kind of remember that as they go forward. 1 or 2 employees can make a big difference. I mean, it makes a big difference in our numbers, but also we know that employees tend to replicate, refer, and refer like employees. So hiring one diverse candidate, can help you, bring another diverse candidate in the door. And so that, I think that's important. When I look at terminations, particularly for minorities, females is about consistent, but for minorities, the termination level is much less than the intake level. So we would expect that in 2021, the total minority numbers are going to look even better. Okay, we did have one goal from an underutilization shortfall for last year, and that was with regards to females in the project management area. The shortfall, again, was statistically not terribly significant because, again, 1 or 2 hires could make the difference between whether there's a perceived shortfall or not. In this particular case, we set the goal for new hires and promotions, and we met that goal. There wasn't a prior year goal, but this was the only goal that we were required to have based on prior year underutilizations. Now, that said, even though our other subcategories may not be statistically significant, I think we should pay attention to any area. So even if we're, 1.6% underutilized in one area, it doesn't hurt, if you find one more diverse candidate, then we're 8% overutilized technically with that category. I think we're always looking, to be on the safe side of that. Or I shouldn't say the safe side, just the accurate side. Our workforce should replicate our communities. I mean, that's really the goal here, is not to have too many of one, not enough of the other. It's that our workforce should reflect our community. So when we look at applicant data, this looks pretty good. Minority applicants accounted for 30.8% of all of our applicants. And again, you see 30.8% of applicants, 34% of hires, so that's pretty good. Female applicants is right on track. 34% of all of our applicants are female, 34% of all of our hires are female. So again, pretty good consistent data. If OFCCP did come in and look at this, they would say, looks good. They would drill down to some more things, but on the face of it, this is pretty encouraging data. There's clearly not obvious signs of overt discrimination or anything of that nature. Within the results, because we've got some small pools, and this is why we don't talk about every single pool, because our pools are small, we end up with some kind of bizarre results sometimes. So for example, for project managers personnel, technically, after they ran the data, one of the flags they found last year was that males were being adversely impacted with regards to females. And that's not an action item because I don't think it's a problem. But statistically, that's what it showed, is that we were, again, maybe trying to make up for a shortfall in that category, and we hired what the data or the AI would perceive as too many females compared to, again, the statistical norm in the community. So again, that's not an action item. It's not anything for us to worry about, but these are good examples that tell us why we don't look at every category and get too excited on any one particular category. Clerical workers, same thing. It showed that females were being adversely impacted with respect to males. And again, that's a matter of hiring one or two clerical workers that are men, and suddenly it may shift the balance from a statistical example. In all of our cases, the shortfalls were one or two employees. So when we get the reports back from the third party that does all this data, it's either, you might have some statistical shortfalls, but they won't even be highlighted in yellow. So they're not even actionable. Okay. So with that said, the data is good, but increasing diverse candidates is always an ongoing process. And I think that we should always be seeking to reflect the communities we work in, even if the shortfalls are tiny. And like I said, one or two hires can resolve any underutilization and also creates following on network and referral and application benefits for us. Okay, moving on to our results for veterans and disabled employees. For veterans, we are doing great, right? So these they don't look at on a county by county or state by state basis, but they just look at them for nationwide. For nationwide, the U.S. has a benchmark of 5.9% for hiring. Our hiring numbers for veterans last year were 11.3%, so close to double the benchmark. I think our total veteran numbers are closer to 15 or 16%. And again, it was significant enough for us to apply for and win the Platinum Medallion status. For employees with disabilities, we're also doing very well. The government has overall benchmarked this number at 7%. Again, it's nationwide. It's not per category or per job category or per location. We are at 10.7% overall. Again, all this is self-certified applicant attested data. So I think, again, we're doing very well there. So they do break this down category by category, and our numbers here are a little bit bizarre. In a lot of categories, we are under the benchmark, and in a couple categories, we're just way over the benchmark. So I don't know exactly what to make of that. I don't, again, think there's anything actionable other than that sometimes data, works itself out in funny ways. But again, the government sets a nationwide standard. When we look at our numbers nationwide, we're doing fine here. The one thing that we do need to do for disabilities is we need to track accommodations. And we are putting in place as we speak a mechanism to do that on EchoNet. And so basically what this says is if somebody has a disability and they request some sort of reasonable accommodation, we always do it. We've never had a case where we haven't worked with our employees to give them what they need to get their job done. But one of the requirements is we track it. And currently we're tracking it on an Excel spreadsheet, which is not ideal. So that will go on to EchoNet, and also we'll have just better historical tracking. Now, what this is again, accommodations for people who are experiencing disability. So if I request a stand-up desk or 2 monitors because I think that's going to help me be more effective in my job, that's not an accommodation request that's granted. If I request a stand-up desk because I have some back problems and I need that stand-up desk in order to be able to work a full day, then that's the type of thing that would be accommodated. If I have some sort of condition where I need to work a flexible schedule or potentially work at a different location. Let's take a really obvious example. I'm not mobile. I'm in a wheelchair. I don't want to be on the 3rd floor of the office. I would like you to relocate my office to the 1st floor so that I don't have to contend with stairs and elevators all day. All right. So anything from something that's that obvious to something that's any sort of accommodation, whether it's in schedule, special equipment, just whatever we can do to make our employees' work performance better to help them work around their disability. Those are the things that we need to be tracking. And again, you'll see that rolled out in 2021 online so that it'll be a pretty easy automated process. All right, so that's kind of it for this session. I'm a little bit over my 30-minute goal, but I set it for 40 minutes just in case, and so we can deal with any questions. So just to review our obligations, we have to track all of our relevant employment actions, job offers, we track promotions, terminations. Again, the third party looks at all of those to make sure not only are we getting enough people in the door, but making sure that we're not disproportionately putting people out the door that negates all the good work of getting applicants in the door. So we look at promotions, terminations, other recruiting efforts. We track and we report that data every year to the government. We post all of our openings and we track data to increase applicant flow. And again, as an overarching thing, we don't discriminate, right? So we don't make any of these job actions, hiring, firing, promoting, counseling, discipline, wages, benefits, you name it, based on race, gender, disability, or veteran status, or any other protected status. So that's it for my time. I'd like to thank everybody, and I'll just quickly check the chat, or Ryan or Natalie, if we have any questions. Paul Hunt has asked, where is the track data stored? So I'm not sure if I understand the question, but it's on SharePoint. But there's track data, then there's normalized data. So the data where you check, I'm this gender and I'm this race, that's only in cost point. So I don't see it when we send the data to the third party. It comes back to us, and it's anonymized to an extent. But the data is secure. Paul, I don't know if I've answered your question or not, because I'm not sure if I understood the question.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering, like, if I wanted to see an update status of where we are at, where would I find it?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So you won't be able to see an updated status, but anybody who wants to look at the plan, let me know. I mean, one of our obligations is that we do make it available for people. And I'm happy to go through it with you. I will tell you, one of the reasons that I put this presentation together is because it is very complicated. And so I'll just tell you, and I'm almost happy to go through it with you because it's funny, but it's when they send us the files back, I think we get 25 separate files. And so you have to click on, okay, this is, this location, this category, this gender, that's a file, this category, this location, this race. And it's a lot of granular data. And then there's, finally a file that has, some semblance of a kind of a summary overview that's a little bit more helpful. Okay, and then we've got another question here. How many of the new hires were rehires? In this plan year, 2020, very few. Last year, a good number, over 24. So I'm not sure that tilted our numbers one way or the other, because our numbers have always been pretty diverse. So question, does an employee need to self-identify ADA qualified disability if special accommodation is not currently sought? And the answer to that is no. Nobody sees the identification. So let's say you even had a visual disability. Let's say you are in a wheelchair. That's just the most kind of obvious example. You can check the box. Do you have a disability? You can check the box. No, right? And I can't, go say, are you sure? Do you need to rethink your answer? Everybody self-identifies their own disability, and again, it's disability or perceived disability. So you could be discriminated against based on the fact that people think you have an issue or think that you know that you used to have an issue. So again, everybody has the flexibility to check that box or not check that box. I would say that, again, because we compare ourselves to the benchmark, it's helpful for us if they do have a disability to check the box yes. But there's not really any penalty. If we were at 6% instead of 10, I don't think there's any consequence. So it kind of just is what it is. We have another question. Thank you guys for all the questions. This is very helpful. As an active hiring manager, is there a way I can see statistics in my directorate? Yes and no. So we'll take that offline. We do have all the data by group, and we have the data by location. So I'll kind of need to work with you to figure out, what that means, your directorate. So for example, within mine, I could do it pretty easily because mine is legal. But if you say yours is project managers, they spread over, that's how we track it. We'll be tracking it by project managers. So I can't just tell you only your project manager. I can tell you all the project managers company-wide. But at any rate, I can probably do more than I think I can, or I could even maybe put you in touch with our consultant over at Berkshire, and just say, hey, I've got a manager who's interested in these employees, and maybe if we identify who those are for him. he could run some data for us. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and that's the last question. We are at 12:10, which is just perfect. Pretty clean recording, so thank you all for your time. If you have any questions, please let me know offline, and we'll answer those for you, and we'll, for future reference, post this up to Talent LMS and up to the ECC YouTube channel. Sorry, that's a blunder. So that you can refer back to this in the future if you need to.